Hey guys, we're glad that you clicked on this link to watch this video. We hope that it encourages you and helps you in your spiritual growth. But we'd also like to encourage you not to use this as a substitute for church. We believe that it's important for you to gather with the local saints on a regular basis, whether that be here at the church at West Mountain or a church that's close to you. We hope that you enjoy this message.
Grab your Bibles, turn to Exodus chapter 3. I hope you can get there quickly because we've got a lot to read today. And so really, I just want to jump right in and start reading. I feel like it's important for us to read all of Exodus 3 this morning. And so a bit of a long reading for us, but I think it will be beneficial. Exodus chapter 3. If you're there, say I'm there. Here we go. Now Moses was keeping his flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame out of fire out of the midst of the bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. And when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses, and he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression of which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, But I will be with you, and this shall be a sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. And then Moses said to God, If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Say to this people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And God also said to Moses, Say this to the people of Israel, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel, gather and say to them, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt. And I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. And they will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of all Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say, The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. And now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I do in it. And after that, he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty. But each woman shall ask of her neighbor, and any woman who lives in her house, for silver and gold and jewelry and for clothing. And you shall put them on your sons and your daughters, and so you shall plunder the Egyptians. What we just read is the call of Moses. We're talking about calling over these several weeks, 9 weeks altogether. And I want to start this morning by just answering a couple questions that have actually been asked of me over these past several weeks because we're talking about calling. And my fear is for just a minute that we're going to use the word calling so much that it's going to become familiar to us. And so we're not going to really know what it actually is. So remember the definition of calling. Calling is where God's plan intersects my passion, my purpose, and my capability. Calling in my life is where God's plan intersects my passion, my purpose, and my capability. And so here's 2 questions that have been asked me the past several weeks. And the first one is this: does your calling change? Does your calling change? And I think the answer is a bit delicate. But I'm taking our staff through a leadership book right now, and it's called H3 Leadership. And in 2 weeks, we're going to go through a chapter on calling. And here's what he basically says in the chapter on calling. He says that your calling stays the same, but your assignments change. He said that you and I have seasonal assignments in our life, and the whole sum of those seasonal assignments should add up to our overall life calling. And so for whether you're the youngest person in the room or whether you're the oldest person in the room, God has an overall calling on your life, but there is a season of life that you're in right now that He's going to give you a specific assignment that is very close and can be empowered by your calling. We're going to see this in the life of Moses as we walk through this. There's going to be a day where Jethro is going to come to him and say, hey, you need more help with leadership. And then it's going to come to a day where Moses realizes that he's not going to be the guy that actually gets to go into the promised land. And so his calling didn't change, but his assignment changed. And so he's bringing up a young man named Joshua that would bring those people into the promised land. So your calling doesn't change, your assignments change. The second question that I've been asked, and it's very, very interesting to me, this question, and it was this: if I refuse my calling, will God give me another one? See, I think half of you moaned, but half of you are like, well, I'm wondering because there was this time in your life where you knew what your calling was, but then you refused that calling, whether it was your own stubborn will or whether you sinned or whether you felt like you were disqualified, and you said, well, God forgot about that, so maybe He's got something different for me. But let me remind you that in Romans chapter 11, it says that God has not changed His mind about your gifts or your calling. It says that they are irrevocable. And here's what I believe. I believe that God has put a calling on your life, and if you've refused it, the thing for you to do this morning is go back to where you refused the calling and say, God, will you forgive me for that? And I want to start and pick up there, no matter what my age is. And my fear is, for the more experienced generation in here, my fear is that some of you understand what I'm saying? Okay. My fear is that for some of you that you have either walked away from your calling or you've refused your calling, and what you've said now is, I'm too old for it to even matter. That's my fear. I really, really hope that I'm wrong. But God hasn't changed His mind. He wants to take you back to where He called you. And here's what I know about this. When we refuse our calling, God has a plan. God has a plan. He's got something in mind that He's wanting to accomplish, and He will accomplish that plan. It's interesting to me that He's going to accomplish the plan, but He looks at me and He looks at you and He says, hey, I'd like to bring you into the plan so you can get in on some of this goodie. God's going to do it with or without you, but He's extended this invitation to you and to me to bring us into the plan. It gets me back to where we need to go today, because God does have a plan, doesn't He? God has a plan. We didn't read this, but I think it's important for us to go back and read Exodus chapter 2, the last part of Exodus 2, beginning in verse 23. He says, during those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob, and God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. I wish that, and I actually may just preach that text during our Advent series at Christmas, but it's amazing to me that God has a plan, and God sees the affliction of his people. God knows what's going on. God hears their cry. God hears their moans. This is like a 40-year gap. Okay, so Moses is born. There's a 40-year gap. He kills an Egyptian. He's in the wilderness for a long time. There's a 40-year gap. And then all of a sudden, we're going to walk into chapter 3, the burning bush. But in the midst of all of that, God sees what's going on with his people. And I love how the text says it. It says that God hears, that God sees, and that God knows. For those listening to the podcast or watching online, they didn't catch the beginning of what we did this morning, but God sees, and God hears, and God knows what's happening in our country. God sees, and God hears, and God knows what's happening in your family. For some of us in here this morning, we may go, I think that God has forgotten about the promise that he made to me about this in my life. I think that God has forgotten about our country, and now we're just going downhill. I think God has forgotten about our family, and I'm here to tell you this morning that God sees, and God hears, and God knows, and part of God seeing, and God hearing, and God knowing is looking at you in the midst of the story and saying, I'm trying to use you to make this different. Once again, super scary for us who struggle with that. In the text, verse 24, it says, God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham. Now listen, it wasn't that something triggered God and he was like, oh yeah, I forgot. God didn't remember like you and I remember. Like we set reminders on our phone like, hey, you need 2 gallons of milk. And so when you get to the grocery store, it actually reminds you that you need to get milk because you walked into Walmart wanting to spend $5 and you walked out spending $100, not even getting the milk. Somebody just said, amen. It's not like God forgot. It means that God had a plan. And in God's plan, there's always the what and there's always the when. And God says, hey, it's time. It's time. The people of God have lived in oppression for long enough, and it's time. And then chapter 3 just kind of blows up in this calling, in this dialogue that I think is so common for you and I to have with God as well. I've given you statements over the past 3 weeks. I'm going to work from those statements, but here's the statement for this morning. Actually, I'm going to give you 2 statements this morning because I couldn't figure out which one I liked best. Okay? And so I'm going to give you both of those, and we'll just cover everybody. The first one is this, is that calling is initiated and empowered by knowing who God is. Calling is initiated and empowered by knowing who God is. Okay, so that's statement number 1. Statement number 2 is this. Calling is less about what you do and more about who God is. Calling is less about what you do and more about who God is. I think we'll see this work out in our text today. If you're writing things down, write this down as well. Number 1, God always initiates. God always initiates. We see Moses on the backside of a wilderness mountain tending sheep, minding his own business. Now, can you get this picture? That Moses is out here, there's all these sheep. He's got his father-in-law's sheep, for goodness sake, not even his own sheep. They're his father-in-law's sheep, and he's doing his everyday routine of tending sheep. And then all of a sudden, in the midst of his everyday routine, God shows up in what you and I would call a miraculous way. I'm wondering because here's what we do. Once again, we struggle with the idea of calling because we think that calling tends to be vocational for guys like me on a platform. And you go, Eric, I'm an everyday, normal kind of guy. I'm just going to school. I'm just going to work. I'm just trying to make ends meet. I'm just trying to survive. And I think Moses was in the mundane of life here. But all of a sudden, in the midst of his mundane life, there is a burning bush. Verse 2 says it this way: that the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. Now, we finally have fall weather. Praise the Lord. Hey, don't get too excited. Summer's coming back probably next week, but then winter's going to come on full steam. Okay? But like it's fire season now, right? Even though we're under a burn ban, fire season is upon us. Obey the law. But there's something about fire that kind of draws us to it. And so can you imagine this guy is out here minding his own business, and all of a sudden there's this bush that looks like it's burning. And I know there's theologians in the room, and they say, well, in that age and that era, in that desert, sometimes, that the bushes would just combust and they would burn, or maybe they had this red hue and it would just kind of glow a little bit. These are the same people that would tell you that the Red Sea crossing was them just kind of crossing through a bit of a marsh, and then the high tide came and kind of ran the Egyptians off. Listen to me. All that is foolishness. My Bible says that there was a bush that was burning and it was not being consumed. And so God is moving in this miraculous way in the midst of a normal, mundane, everyday life. But I want you to get this, because it says the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame. And I know that many of you already know what I'm about to say, but who in the world is the angel of the Lord? Because I think this is highly important for us this morning. I believe that the angel of the Lord there is Jesus. It's the pre-incarnate Jesus. Incarnation was Jesus when he came in the flesh, but this is the pre-incarnate Jesus. This is before Jesus was in the flesh. And I've heard that talked about, and I've heard that said before, but I really want to tell you why I believe that. Because all through the Old Testament, when we see references to the angel of the Lord, what we see is that angel is actually speaking as God, not for God. Every time you see it, he's not saying, well, thus says the word of the Lord. He's saying, hey, listen to the word of the Lord. I am God. He also identifies himself as God many times. And then as you look through the Old Testament, you would see that people who have encountered the angel of the Lord, they would describe it this way, is that they would say that they have seen who? God. Then we get all the way to the New Testament, and guess what disappears? The angel of the Lord. References to the angel of the Lord disappear, and then all of a sudden we start getting references to angels, but they're either referenced in a very generic way or they're actually named. Eric, why is that so important for us today? Because the story of the Bible is a story of Jesus. And if we know the stories of the Bible and not know the story of the Bible, we're going to be very confused about some things that are happening. See, Jesus is already showing up in a way to say, listen, I am going to ultimately one day be the deliverer. I'm the one that speaks into the lives of those and empowers those to do the work of God on my behalf. But God shows up in a bush. I would be willing to bet that in the midst of your normal life this past week that God may have showed up for you and you missed it because you thought it was just a normal Tuesday. See, when we begin to think about calling, when we begin to think about what we want to do for the Lord, sometimes what we think is, okay, I need to go close the door. I need to get in my closet. I need to either put the worship music on, if that's your kind of deal, or I need complete silence. And I'm going to get on my face, and I'm going to beg, and I'm going to plead with God for him to show me and call me. Isn't that what we normally think? Moses just minding his business, doing a Tuesday. And God says, here I am. I need your attention because we're fixing to do something big in the kingdom. All right. Too practical for you this morning? I hope that this week that you're having a normal Thursday and God just wrecks your world. I really do. Do I want him to do that this morning? Absolutely. Do I want God to speak to you? Absolutely. But I'm telling you that it's in these moments, like we're in right here, we're in a worship service and we just sang and my goodness, you were singing your lungs out this morning. Absolutely incredible. But see, it's in those moments that we expect God to do something, but God may want to do it and catch us off guard and say, hey, listen, I want to do it just the normal activity of your life. God initiates. Okay, that's number one. Number two, calling always has an element of obedience. Calling always has an element of obedience. Okay, and so God speaks to him out of a bush. Okay, or there's just a bush on fire. Verse 3, and Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight while the bush is not burned. Isn't that so just mundane? I'd be like, oh my gosh, there's a bush on fire. I will turn aside and see this sight while this bush is not burned. But look at this, verse 4. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God did what? Called. See, God's going to do something in your life, and it may just be to get your attention to go, hey, listen, God is moving in my everyday life. It's when we turn and we look and we see and we set our eyes is when God begins to speak out of the bush. And he says, Moses, Moses. I think Moses began this level of obedience, this walk of obedience to his calling when he saw the bush and it wasn't being burned. And there was something about the bush that drew him because God was initiating. And then God saw that he turned aside and God said to him, Moses, Moses. Okay, maybe this is hypothetical, but have you ever just been in one of these moments where you're driving down the road and you know you just went through the intersection and you thought to yourself, was that red or green? You ever have those moments? Okay. And you're thinking about something and then all of a sudden God just kind of just spikes something in you. And then your response would be, God, what was that? And then all of a sudden he starts speaking to you. Am I the only one? Some of you went through the intersection with me, but some of you don't know about the rest of the story. But you're just minding your own business every normal everyday Tuesday, and then all of a sudden this thought goes across your mind. It's something random, but it's something in the kingdom, and it's something that maybe you would never think of. And then you said, God, what was that? And all of a sudden he begins to unpack and relay, hey, listen, I want to draw you into something. See, some of us aren't getting the second half of that because we think that we ate bad pizza. So some of you aren't getting the second half of the calling because you think that was just something random that was happening in your everyday life. But listen to me, God's wanting to get our attention and he initiates that. Listen, I believe he initiates that through your personality. I believe there's things that speak to you that don't speak to me. Once again, we talked about there's things that are brokenness that draw me that don't draw you. But I think that God wants to initiate, like maybe Moses was a pyrotechnician. Like he loved fire, you know? Maybe that's how he called him. I like fire. You know how it is. You sit around fire, you could stare at that thing for hours, just mesmerized. But God's going to speak, but there's this element of obedience that that has to happen on our part. And then God begins to speak. The Lord saw that he turned aside to see, and God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses, and he said, here I am. And then God begins to show him some incredible things. So God initiates, there's always an element of obedience, and then the call. God initiates, there's an element of obedience, and then the call. And then I think there's three aspects to the call, and we'll work through all these. One, who's calling you? Why is there a call? And what's the assignment? I think it's super important. Who's calling? Why is there a call? And what is the assignment? Verse 6, verse 5, he tells them the thing that we like to say, take your sandals off your feet, for the place which you're standing is holy ground. And then immediately God says to him, I am the God of your fathers, your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. That's an important phrase for us. He says it over and over and over again, but it's always important for us to know who's calling us. Listen to me. Do not be fooled this morning that if there's an open door, that's the one you need to walk through. I know it. We Christianize things up, well, I'm going to walk through every open door there is. Listen to me, Jonah had an open door to go to a different town. If you got open door policy, you need to begin to try to think about changing that, because Satan will open some doors for you. And so it's important for us to know who is calling, and God speaks to him out of the bush, and he says, I need to let you know who's about to give you some incredible call in your life. It is the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He knew that phrase. He knew that phrase. That phrase was ingrained in him. It's actually going to be the same phrase that he says, hey, when you go to your people, you need to let them know it was the God of their fathers that sent you, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And so we need to know who is calling us. If you backtrack all the way to week 1, we can really, really mess our calling up. And then we talked about it last week as well. If we want to operate in selfish motives and we go, hey, listen, I'm going to be the one that calls me. I'm going to do what I want to do, and I'm not going to seek the wisdom and the guidance of God. But listen to me, if you're in here this morning and it's God that is calling you, it's God that is calling you, then you are going to be empowered with an incredible, incredible calling. Who's calling? It's the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And he's going to begin to tell him, why is there a call? Verse 7. Then the Lord said, I've surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. Taskmasters. I just can't say that word. Taskmasters. I know their suffering, and I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, and all those ites. Okay? Verse 9, behold, the cry of people has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Now, if you're like me, and I'm in the middle of this conversation right here with God, I'm going, finally. Like where were you at 40 years ago? Where were you at 40 years ago when I took care of the Egyptian, but then I had to run? Hey, God, where were you? Because that was stirring inside of me a long time ago, and now you want to talk about it? Is that just my personality in the text? See, I think we're the same way, because God is stirring and initiating some things in us, but God is waiting for the right time, and then God speaks that into our life, and we're like, no kidding, God. No kidding, these people are being oppressed. No kidding, these people are being enslaved. And here's what I think is happening. I think that God is actually trying to reactivate that place in him that may have died 40 years ago. You remember? He went out And in his heart, he thought that he should go look upon his brothers. And when he saw one of the Egyptians beating one of the Israelites, he killed him and put him in the sand. Remember that was in his heart, that was in his being. And God says, I need to reactivate what's going on. And God says, I'm going to step in and I'm going to remove them from this place of slavery, and I'm going to move them to a good land, a broad land, a land with milk and honey. I've seen the oppression. I'm going to end the oppression. I've seen them in Egypt, and I'm going to bring them out of Egypt. And Moses is going, yes, that's what you need to do. That's what you need to do. That's what you need to do. And then God says, hey, I need you. I need you. The assignment, verse 10. And come, I'll send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Maybe I've got too much of an imagination. But at this moment, I'd be like, maybe that bush wasn't burning. But isn't that us? We have this spot in us where we see this injustice in the world, or we see something that needs to be set right, or this calling in our life, and God's like, yes, I see it as well, and I want this thing to be set right. And you're like, yes, I want you to set it right. And God says, I want you to help me set this thing right. And we go, but are you sure? Are you sure? See, the calling in our life can be one of the scariest things. When God says to you, this is where I want to use you in the world, for the good of the world and for the good of my kingdom, I think that's a heavy weight to set on us. And Moses is in this same place. And so God calls him. God tells him why he's going to call him. And then he gives them a simple 1-sentence assignment. Some of you are like, I need an 8-step plan. We need to get into an office with a whiteboard. We need to chart this thing out. We need to see the end before the beginning. And, all these things are clicking with us. And God says, hey, let's go. I'm going to send you to Pharaoh, and you're going to bring my people out of Egypt. That's it. Like, what's step 2? No step 2, step 1. That's it. That's it. And I think that sometimes we're so scared of the call because it may be that simple. It may be that simple. It may be so simple that God would say, hey, listen, I want you to minister to unwed mothers. You know that there's a ton of unwed mothers in our world, whether it's by their choice or not their choice. It may be just that simple. It may be, it says, hey, I want you to lead the band at Gilmer in a godly way. What if it's that simple? And it scares us to death, and then we respond the way that Moses responds, and I actually really think he responds with a good question. Verse 11. He says, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Like, stick your name in there. Stick your life in there and go, hey, God, who am I that you would allow me to be an influence in someone's life? God, who am I that you would stick me in this place of brokenness when I've got brokenness myself? God, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? And I know that we love to talk about our identity in Christ, and that's a beautiful thing for us to do because it's good for us to know who we are in Christ. But God does not respond to him by telling him who he is. Moses, you are loved. Moses, you are cared for. Moses, you are fearfully and wonderfully made, even though he was. What is God's response? Moses says, who am I? And God says, I'll be with you. God, I don't know if I should do this because I'm not sure that I'm the right one. We'll get into all of his insecurities next week. God, who am I? And God responds with, I will be with you. Remember our statements that we're trying to deal with this morning, that calling is initiated and empowered by knowing who God is, and that calling is less about what you do and more about who God is. Because if we get to this place where we're so infatuated with what we have to do, it will become overwhelming. But if we are in the middle of this and we say, there's an assignment over here, but I know who's sending me on assignment, it changes everything. He says, who am I? And the response is I will be with you. It's amazing to me as we read this text, and I know that some of you are like, just get to verse 14. I am who I am. Just get to verse 14. Because that's where we want to go. But we're missing lots of things in between because there's something that's happening here that's a bit subtle unless you really think about it. Who am I that I should go? And God tells him, I will be with you. But then Moses makes this response in verse 13, and he really says, I don't even know who you are. Look at verse 13. And Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what's his name? What am I going to say? Do you see this? That God has put this huge calling on Moses' life, and he's not even knowing the name of the person that's sending him. God's trying to show him who he is, trying to show him that he's the father of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. But he says, hey, listen, I need to know that when I go tell these people that you came, what name am I going to tell them? Isn't it amazing? Is it amazing to you? Like he doesn't have the familiarity with God to even know his name at this point. We'll deal with this some more next week, but see, some of you are like, I don't even know enough to do anything for God. I'm not equipped enough to do anything for God, but he doesn't even know who he is. What's his name? And what am I going to say to them? And then verse 14, God says to Moses, I am who I am. And another translation of that is, I be who I be. Okay, and that's some of you English people are like, but that's almost how it translates. I be who I be. And he said, you say this to the people. The I am has sent me to you. And then God said, say this to the people of Israel. The Lord, same phrasing there. It should be capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D in your Bible. The Lord, the God of your fathers of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered through all generations. Go gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me saying, I observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt, and I promise that I'm going to bring you out of your affliction. See, there is this moment where Moses and you and I must get to, where we know that the steps that we're about to take are more about Yahweh God than anything else that we do. If you think you're about to go conquer the world to make a bunch of people's life easier, or feed a bunch of homeless people, or whatever, and God is not the one that's empowering that, listen to me, you may be successful for a moment. But there's going to be a day when you wake up and you say, this is too hard for me, I can't do it. And you'll pack your bags and you'll stay at home. There'll be a moment where God says, you see that area of brokenness right there? That's where I want you to go. And you'll say, listen, I can't do that. But because it's not a place where a bunch of people would see it. It's not a place of prestige, and actually it's a bit messy. And you'll turn your back and you'll walk away from it. But listen to me this morning. There are some days, and the only story I have is mine, right? Okay, and so if you've heard me say some of these things before, I'm sorry, it's the only story I have. But there are some days where this pastoring is hard. And I told you last week, you're a beautiful and gracious people to pastor. But there are some days where there's things in the inbox that you'd rather not read. There's phone messages that you would rather not have to return. There are visits that you would rather not make. And listen to me. If I thought it was about me, I'd just stay home and cut firewood. But there are days that the only thing that gets me out of bed, besides my love for my wife and my kids, and maybe the thing that gets me in my truck and drives me this way, is the calling on my life. And knowing that it is a calling initiated by Yahweh, Jehovah, the Lord. And so this morning, it's not about what we do necessarily. It's about who is God and what is He wanting to do in this world. It's not about what can I accomplish, but it's about who is God. And here's what He says, that my name is to be remembered forever throughout all generations. Moses, listen to me. You've only been around for about 80 years at this point, buddy. I've been around for forever. You're going to die here in a few years, and guess what? I'm going to remain. You're thinking that you want to lead people to a promised land. Moses, I am the promised land. You think that you want to deliver. Moses, I am deliverance. Moses, I am freedom. Moses, I be who I be. And I can be anything I want to be. I can be anywhere I want to be. I can do anything I want to do in the scope and the character of God's nature. And Moses, if you'll trust me, there's going to be this moment where you're going to feel so inadequate for what I'm asking you to do. But you can look and go, I can do this because I'm with Him. Silly illustration, and then I'll let us go, okay? Maybe this is just the providence of God. We were talking about our age, and they just came out with the remake of Lion King. And I was talking to my kids like that was my childhood, Lion King. Everybody know what I'm talking about, Lion King? Okay, I probably know a bit more about Lion King than I should. Just honest moment. But there's so many aspects of the Lion King that I just love. When the cheetahs are talking and they begin to talk about Mufasa. Mufasa. Do it again. Mufasa. Mufasa, Mufasa, Mufasa. Okay, y'all seen it, right? Hyenas. What did I say? Cheetahs, hyenas. See? You're hyenas. Maybe I don't know as much as I thought I did. You try talking in front of people for every week. You'll mess it up too. But why did they do that? Because they knew that He was the king. He knew that He was the most powerful. And then Simba kind of gets out of line for a little bit. And the hyenas have him circled up. And he starts growling at him. It's pretty good, wasn't it? And they start laughing at him. And all of a sudden he sucks back one good time and he goes, roar. But it wasn't him, it was who? Mufasa. And the hyenas scattered. Listen to me. Maybe this is bad analogy, but you and I are Simba. And God is Mufasa. I probably shouldn't say that. But there's this moment where you and I are going to be trying to growl into the world because we know it's what we're supposed to do. And it's so puny and it's so silly, but all of a sudden, the great I am is going to come flying in. And all of a sudden, your simple obedience is going to be exploded into exponential kingdom growth. John chapter 8, the Pharisees are giving Jesus a bad time. And they begin to talk about Moses, and they begin to talk about all of the things that he is. And Jesus said, I need to let you know something. Abraham. He said, before Abraham was, I am. And they ripped their clothes because they knew what he had said. In the garden on the night that Jesus is being arrested, they walk up to him in darkness with torches and swords. And they say, hey, we're looking for Jesus. And what does he say to them? I am. And what does Scripture say? They fell as dead men to the ground. Why? Because the power is about the great I am. The calling is about the great I am. And many of you this morning know exactly what you need to do, but you've been scared. Listen to me. You don't have to be scared. You don't have to be scared. You have the great I am. Nothing can come against you that he doesn't allow. Nothing will touch you that doesn't go through his hands. And everything that you will accomplish, that will be substantial, that will be eternal, will be empowered by him. Will you this morning trust that he is who he says he is? The great I am. Let's pray.